I worked at a retail store in my 20s as a night manager. It wasn't one of the usual big wholesale stores. It was a local place with only about 8 or 9 locations. Most nights I'd usually have a night assistant to help out, but it wasn't uncommon for me to end up spending the entire shift alone again. Because it wasn't the biggest store, the work environment wasn't too intense. Often I'd find myself working slowly just to avoid running out of things to do. This was one of those nights where I was alone and working at a steady pace. At the start of my shift, I loaded some boxes and moved to the aisles to begin organizing the merchandise. It didn't require much mental effort, so my mind wandered elsewhere, just thinking about random things without really paying attention. I went through about 3 aisles until a knock on the entrance door startled me. I almost didn't register what it was because I was so lost in thought. But once I realized, I became very confused. I heard them knock again hard enough to echo throughout the store. I walked to the end of the aisle and looked through the large front window, seeing a man with a hat standing at the door. I approached from the other side. "We're closed. Won't open until 8 a.m., I said through the glass. The man stared at me but didn't say anything. I pointed to the sign on the door. "We're closed, sorry," I repeated. The man continued to stare for a few seconds, then turned and left. I watched him walk away until I couldn't see him anymore, but I didn't see him park his car anywhere. The whole incident was strange to say the least, but I figured he was just in the wrong place or something. I went back to what I was doing, stocking shelves, and eventually forgot about the man. At 2 a.m., I was halfway through the aisles and ready for lunch break. I left the box where it was and went to the break room at the other end of the building. I was there for maybe half an hour before I tossed the rest of my lunch and went back to work. I walked through the store and to the aisle I was working on, but as I looked up, there was a man walking past the other end. He looked like he was just walking through the store without noticing me. I froze in place, feeling that sudden fear. Now listening intently, I could hear the footsteps of the man moving towards the side of the building where I had just come from, so I went into the aisle and hid behind the shelves. The footsteps sounded like they were heading towards the break room, but just before I left the aisle to try and run and get help, I heard the sound of the man rushing out of the room. His footsteps were now running through the store closer and closer. I ran to the other end of the aisle, looked back, and saw the man turn in and start running towards me. I ran to the front door, pulling out my keys and trying to unlock it with shaking hands. The man appeared at the end of the aisle just as I opened it, and just as I stepped out of the building, I saw a bright flash out of the corner of my eye and heard a deafening sound. A gunshot so loud I didn't even know where it was coming from, but I ran for my life around the building. I made it to my car and hid in the back seat while calling 911. From what I knew, the man didn't follow me out. He was already gone by the time the police arrived at the store, but they found the back door open along with some heavy tools sitting next to it. The most terrifying of their findings was the hole made by the gunshot was right next to the front door. Why the man entered and so aggressively targeted me like that is unknown from his behavior. The police seemed to think it was some sort of mental shock or psychotic break, with no real reason to target me specifically other than the fact that I was alone. I no longer work there, but I can tell you that for years after that incident, I was always wary every night. I worked at a restaurant with my brother during our high school years. It was a very small restaurant in the outlet shopping center. The two of us worked as servers there, but because the place was small, we often pitched in around the place. washing dishes, delivering orders, or whatever they needed. But after only a year of working there, my brother graduated from high school and chose to go to college, so he quit. But I continued to work there. It happened a few months before I eventually left the job. It was a Friday, so I was working later than usual on weekdays. The restaurant stayed open until midnight every night, but because of school, I usually never stayed too late, no later than 8 or 9. However, that night I was scheduled to close with the manager. Everything was pretty normal, slowing down around 8, and a few people came in to pick up orders for the rest of the night. But at 10:30, my manager received a delivery call. By 11 o'clock, I was driving out of the parking lot and onto the road. The address given on the receipt was only 8 minutes away from the restaurant, but as I drove a few minutes down the road, I got a call from my manager. I answered immediately, thinking they must have canceled, but it turns out the guy called back saying he gave the wrong address. I had to pull over and write down the new address. I typed the new address into the GPS, but soon I knew something was off. It wasn't close at all. It was 25 minutes in the opposite direction of my destination. If they had given this address from the start, the order would have never been accepted. I thought about going back to the restaurant and telling my manager, knowing that he would understand, but I was already out and we had already made the order, so I just started driving. The streets were pretty deserted around town at this time of night, but the further I drove, the emptier the streets became. Like I hadn't even seen another car for the last 5 minutes of my drive. I was in the outskirts where most of the buildings and houses turned into fields and trees. As I approached the street with the given address, all I saw was a row of houses with all the lights off. As I passed more houses, some of them had porch lights on, but still felt deserted. It's worth noting that these weren't the best houses at all. They were all one-story box-style homes. I stopped in front of the house I was supposed to deliver to and parked the car on the side. I felt weird and scared as I approached the door. Outside was eerily silent, and with no street lights and almost no house lights, it was very dark. I knocked on the door and waited. A minute passed with no sign of anyone in the house, and I started to feel a little uncomfortable. So I just left the bag and turned to walk back to my car. They hadn't paid yet, but their food might have gotten cold and it was pointless for me. However, as I looked towards my car, a man stood right behind it. He was bent over as if looking into the window. I froze and I didn't know if the man heard me or what, but he immediately turned towards me. I could barely see his face, but he was older. "Do you need something?" The man didn't move. I asked again, but nothing changed. Feeling increasingly uneasy, I looked around but didn't see anything except trees in the darkness. Then the man backed up a few steps, away from my car, and stood maybe 5 feet from the door. After a while, I began to walk towards him cautiously, hoping to just get in and out so I could leave. When I arrived right in front of the door, the man continued to stare at me from just a few feet away. Carefully, I opened the door and hurried inside, but before I could even close it, the man started screaming. I looked towards him. Now he was facing towards the woods and just screaming. I turned my head slightly to see where he was looking, and in the woods, I could see 2 or even 3 figures rushing towards my car. My immediate thought was that this was a trap and I needed to leave immediately before something happened. I immediately turned back and backed out as the man beside me tried to move behind the car in an attempt to stop me. I could hear and see a group of men shouting at me as I sped away. The police were called, and although not much was found, there were a few things. The house I was supposed to deliver to turned out to be an empty property. It wasn't technically abandoned, but the owner didn't even live in the state anymore. It wasn't even up for sale. It had been left to rot for the past decade. The caller who placed the order was unknown, but the initial address they provided seemed to have no meaning at all. Who those group of people were, what they planned, and so many other things remain unresolved. But I might wonder about it for the rest of my life. After all that ended, even slightly different, I might not even be here now. It was a snowy night when I parked my car in the gas station parking lot where I worked the night shift from 11 to 7, and I had been working there for several months prior. I wasn't particularly fond of this job, but it was hard to find another place to work. And because of some things in other aspects of life, the night shift was the best fit for my personal schedule. Nevertheless, I always showed up to work every night feeling tired and struggling to get through each shift. I parked my car in front of the building next to the only other car in the parking lot, which belonged to my coworker. Then I went inside and took over his shift. He left a few minutes later, and then it was just me alone for the rest of the night. My manager had a paper on the desk with a few things to do, but after reading it, there wasn't much to be done. My estimate was that it wouldn't take more than an hour total to complete all the tasks, so I tried to delay as much as possible to avoid falling asleep, as I started to feel very tired. However, as I sat behind the desk and it was around midnight, a car pulled into the station. I looked out the window and saw an old SUV parked at one of the pumps. Of course, because it was snowing outside, most people weren't driving, but getting a customer every now and then was common. I went back to my phone and scrolled through some videos, not paying much attention for about 10 minutes, until I looked out again and saw the SUV still there by the pump. Its headlights were off and its door closed, as if it should have been pumping gas, but it had been that way for too long. I stood up and approached the window, looking around the buildings both sides, but there was no one outside. If they had been inside the car for the last 10 minutes with the engine off, they'd surely be freezing. Because it was snowing and windy, I honestly felt a bit worried for them. I paid more attention for the next few minutes, waiting to see movement through the dark window, or for someone to return inside their car, but nothing happened. It's like the car was just abandoned by the pump. After thinking for a moment, I put on my jacket and went outside. I immediately knew I was right. It was too cold for anyone to be inside a car with the engine off, or even to be outside for more than a few minutes. I hurried to the car and looked around, then brought my face closer to the window and tried to see inside. "Hello! Is anyone in there? Just checking if you're okay," I called out, but from what I could see, there was no one inside. It wasn't easy to see clearly, so there could have been someone inside, but I was pretty sure there wasn't. Now even more confused, I backed away and looked around the empty gas station parking lot before starting to walk back. Now, with my eyes not focused on the car, I just looked at the ground and saw shoe prints in the snow leading towards the building. Not at the front of the building, but somewhat to the side. I looked back and saw that they seemed to come from the car, but at this point, I froze and didn't want to investigate further without a little warming up first. I went back inside and turned on the small heater next to the cashier desk, putting my hands in front of it to warm them up. I was only inside for 30 seconds to a minute before the sound echoed through the building from behind me. I turned, seeing nothing, then walked around the desk and towards the back on the floor. There was a puddle of dirty melted snow from someone's shoes. Feeling cold, I approached the back room and turned into the corner where the storage room was located. Standing in the darkness behind one of the shelves, I could see the silhouette of someone. They were tall with broad shoulders and had a thick beard, and they were staring directly at me. My heart stopped for a moment, but after the initial shock, my reaction was just to walk back to the cashier desk. I don't know why. Maybe I was too shocked to react properly after staring at the storage room door for I don't know how long. I quietly grabbed the store phone and dialed the police, whispering for help. Then I underwent the most nerve-wracking 10 minutes of my life as I waited. During this time, I didn't hear or see anything from the storage room, which honestly added to my fear. Somehow, the man never came out to confront me. When 2 police officers finally arrived and went inside, I quietly told them where the man was. They searched the room while I stayed in front, but I was surprised when they came out with no one else. The man was already gone. The footprints from the dirty shoes surrounded the back door, but outside, fresh tracks in the snow led straight away from the gas station, directly into the long, dark, empty field that continued on. Of course, it was impossible for anyone to search there at night, but even when they did it in the next few days, they found nothing. I mean, the field was so vast, he could have gone anywhere, but that night was so cold and windy that I was almost sure they would find a body. The SUV was taken in for hopefully more information. I don't know how or why, but somehow they couldn't find any ownership history. So it left us only with what we knew from that night, and we still only have that. Who the man was and what he did remains a mystery, and where he is now is just as unknown. My father took me on a journey to the vast wilderness in Ontario, Canada, near the mountains. While we were exploring, we stumbled upon a giant cave. My father noticed blood trails leading into the cave, and he wanted to investigate. My father brought a rifle and I brought one too, so we thought we were safe enough. As we entered the cave, we followed the blood trails until they led us to a decapitated grizzly bear with its head severed from its body, and its head had been taken out of the cave, hence the blood trails. It was surely like a trophy for whoever did it or something else. We stepped a little further into the cave, and that's when we found something more disturbing. Something truly heart-wrenching. There was a man who looked like he had been mauled by a bear, his intestines spilling out of his stomach, and it was the most horrifying thing I'd ever seen. I think the old man reminded my father of his own father, because the man looked so much like him, and his father had been shot and killed a few years ago in a hunting accident, so it really touched his heart. My father began to cry and experienced total devastation. Initially we were scared, especially me. The dead man's body looked like it had been sitting there for a few days because his face and body had started to decay and change color. We were completely puzzled and didn't know what to do. My father said we wouldn't call the police because we had tampered with evidence, and it was a murder scene, meaning we could become part of the investigation if there was one, and even calling the police would immediately make us suspected as potential suspects, even though we had nothing to hide specifically. However, ultimately, the decision was in my father's hands, so I just left it at that. We later found out about a week later, when it was broadcasted on the news, that the person who decapitated the bear did so because the bear had killed his friend, and the man seemed to try to save his friend by shooting the bear, but he was too late. It was said that the man decapitated the bear out of rage. What we didn't understand is why he didn't call the police after his friend was mauled to death. The whole story is truly horrifying nonetheless, and very strange and eerie to think about. It makes you wonder if there's something else to the story. Personally, I believe that the man killed his friend or that someone else might have killed him, and then the bear ate him after he was already dead. That's the only thing that makes sense to me. The man who killed the bear was completely unknown, and they had no information about him. It's all just speculation. This is just the story we heard. No one ever confessed to anything, and the police didn't even have any potential suspects. It's definitely a mystery in my opinion. My family and I went camping for a year in a small campsite in the middle of the forest. My parents let me bring one friend along. I was kind of excited to go, but I also kind of wanted to stay home over the weekend and play the video game I got for my birthday a few weeks earlier. The night before we left, my dad said I could bring a friend, but only one. That made me much happier to go, and I immediately called my best friend. It took a little convincing, but eventually he gave in and said he would come, as long as he had to check with his mom first. He called me about an hour later, after getting the green light from his mom that he could join us. Leo, my best friend, and I stayed up all night playing Halo and discussing what we would do when we went camping this weekend. I told him that the campsite wasn't like regular campsites in America, with parks and swimming pools with RVs and caravans everywhere. It was truly in the middle of nowhere. There were a few RVs, but most of the campers there camped in tents. Leo was worried it wouldn't be fun, but I reassured him about all the things we could do, and I said we could bring bikes to ride on the trails. Now we could fish in the nearest lake and lots of other things like sitting around the campfire and making s'mores. I mean, the list goes on and on. On our first night there, we did all of that. We even set up a badminton court, and the whole family played. The days flew by quickly, and we had a blast. Now it's Saturday night, and my family and I are getting ready for bed. Leo and I aren't tired, and we don't have any plans to go to sleep right away. We have our own tent, so that's cool because we have our own space away from the adults. I told Leo that we should explore the forest and try to find trails we've never walked before. He agreed to the adventure, so the two of us grabbed flashlights and waited until we were sure everyone else was asleep. We quietly slipped out of our tent and began to walk. We waited to turn on our flashlights, so we were at least about 10 feet or more away from the campsite because we were just careful not to wake anyone up. Leo had the idea that we should walk through the forest with our flashlights off for as long as possible. I didn't really want to do it, but I didn't want to look like a wimp in front of my friend, so I agreed. He walked maybe 3 or 4 minutes with almost no idea where we were going. It was so dark that Leo and I could hardly see each other. I said, "Do you hear that, Leo?" I whispered again very quietly. I turned on my flashlight, and so did Leo. "Do you hear that, right?" I asked. "Yes, what is that?" said Leo. "I'm not sure, it sounds like someone whispering though, and that freaked us out. After we turned our flashlights back on, the whispering stopped. We continued walking with our flashlights on for a minute or two, and we decided it was time to turn our flashlights off again. Less than a minute after we turned off our flashlights, while walking, we heard the whispering again. Although very quietly, like the sound of breaking branches and leaves under our feet almost completely covered the sound. We couldn't understand what was being said, but it sounded like a bunch of gibberish. We immediately turned our flashlights back on, and we were determined to find out where the sound was coming from. We looked around for a moment, and that's when Leo screamed my name. I looked in his direction, and he was frozen like a deer caught in the headlights of a car staring at something. I rushed towards him to see what he was talking about. There was an old woman who looked like she hadn't slept for several days, or bathed for a week, lying half naked on the ground. I looked at her in disbelief because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Then she got up, apologized, and before she left she said that she was sorry again, that she was just looking for her campsite. Then she ran off in the opposite direction. Immediately after that, Leo and I ran back to our tent because we had enough for that night. We talked about what happened in our sleeping bags until we could finally fall asleep. The creepiest thing about this situation is that we were the only visitors nearby half a mile away, which is quite far. That was by far the weirdest thing that has ever happened to me. I woke up to an unexpected message from my boss one morning saying I didn't need to work that day. I was thrilled because it meant I could do whatever I wanted. The kids were at school and my wife was at work, so I had the whole day to myself. Plus, I still got my monthly salary, so I wasn't losing any money at all. It was paid time off. Let me explain it like that. I got up and went through my usual routine, showering and having breakfast. I took my time and did everything a bit slower than usual because I'm always rushing in the mornings, so it was really nice to take a break for once. I sat down and turned on the TV with a smile on my face, trying to figure out how I wanted to spend my day. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy staying at home like anyone else, but I also like going out. I get bored quickly, and I can only watch TV for so long. I decided I would go hiking on a nearby trail that I found from a quick search on Google. I thought about bringing Charlie, my dog, with me, but I decided against it because from what it looked like, it was going to be a fairly long and somewhat difficult hike, and I'm relatively new to hiking, so that's why I chose to go alone. I didn't want to tire Charlie out. About half an hour into the journey and on my way there, I texted my wife to let her know what I was doing. I brought everything I needed for the day, even though I didn't expect to be gone for more than 3 hours. I brought a little extra of everything just in case. I wouldn't say this is something out of character for me, but it's definitely not something I do often. I've been trying to persuade my wife to go hiking with me for the past few months, but we've been so busy that it's been difficult. I've always been someone who enjoys outdoor activities, so I was really excited when I arrived there. I parked my car and got out. I grabbed my backpack and headed straight out. I immediately noticed how few people were there, which I found unusual considering it was a Tuesday morning at 8:45 before I entered the trail. I saw a wooden post with a map on top of it surveying the entire area. I wasn't exactly sure how long this hike would take me, but I had a pretty good idea because I believe it's a fairly popular trail. The trail I took was a 4.5-mile climb. The whole view was absolutely beautiful. The day was gorgeous. There was a gentle breeze, and the sun was perfect, shining on me from behind, and that's exactly what I needed. I was enjoying my time in nature and truly appreciating it. About 20 minutes into my adventure, I put on my headphones, but after a few songs played, my music suddenly stopped. I pulled out my phone to turn the music back on, and I noticed that my phone only had 1 bar of service. Within seconds of that, as I was putting my phone back into my pocket, a deer jumped out right behind me and ran across the trail very quickly and ran through the forest and disappeared in seconds. It startled me so much that I actually jumped, and my heart was pounding. I chuckled quickly when I realized it was just a deer, and I breathed a sigh of relief. But then I looked to my right. That's when I saw someone sitting on the ground with their legs crossed, staring directly at me. They were wearing a creepy mask, and it seemed like they were holding something in their lap, maybe a weapon. From where I stood, it looked like an axe. "Hello," I said. "What are you doing?" The person then stood up, and immediately I thought it was a man because of his height, and he looked pretty muscular. He started walking towards me while swinging his axe. He didn't say a word. I started walking back the way I came, and even left my backpack on the ground. I was just trying to get out of there as fast as I could. The last thing on my mind was my backpack. He picked up his pace a bit and started talking towards me. That's when I started running as fast as I could, and he did too. I ran for 4 years in high school, so thankfully I was prepared to run. Then he threw the axe at me because he might have realized that I was much faster than him. He hit me directly in my left ankle, and it hurt so much and made me fall to the ground. I screamed in pain but managed to get up. Fortunately for me, I think it was the bottom or the shoulder of the axe that hit my ankle directly rather than the blade. Now he was closing in on me, but I managed to grab the axe before he could approach me. I ran as fast as I could with my injured ankle. He was a very tall man. I'm 6 feet 2 inches tall, and this guy was probably about 4 inches taller than me. I just prayed to God that I could find the strength within me to escape and make it home safely. My only chance of survival was to run or beat him to death with the axe, and that was the last thing I wanted to do. He could easily overpower me if it came to that. I kept running and chose not to look back. I just ran as fast as I could. I still had quite a distance to go back to my car, and I was determined to make it, although I wasn't too sure about my chances. I really gave my opponent a run for his money. I finally looked back after a few minutes of running, and I saw that he was no longer behind me. That didn't stop me from running, though. I threw the axe away because honestly, it just slowed me down, and I ran all the way back to my car while stopping briefly to catch my breath. Eventually, I made it back to my car, but I still didn't have any service. There was no one in sight who could help me. As I left the park, the masked man stood right next to one of the stop signs near the exit gate. He stood there staring at me. I felt his eyes piercing into me even though I tried not to pay attention. I called the police and filed a report. But the man is still out there somewhere lurking in the darkness looking for his next victim as they never managed to find him. I've never gone hiking since then. This happened about 4 years ago when I was babysitting my younger brothers while my dad went out for the night. I was 15 years old at the time and was the oldest among them, so I was responsible. The only one I really had to keep an eye on was my youngest brother. He was 7 years old at the time. The others were 11 and 13 years old. They mostly just spent time together as usual in their room. My youngest brother, Jason, on the other hand, I had to keep an eye on most of the night. He sat on my lap and watched me play video games with my friends online. My dad ordered pizza for us, and when it arrived, we were all very excited. I collected loose change totaling $3.50 for a tip, but that's all I could gather. I figured it was better than nothing at all. I grabbed the pizza and gathered all my brothers to let them know the pizza was here. We all took our own slices of pizza and went back to my room. When I returned to my game, one of my friends made a joke and said to make sure I lock my bedroom door. He knew I had a bad habit of forgetting, so I thought he was just being thoughtful and looking out for me. I rushed back to the front door to make sure I had locked it. Turns out I had actually forgotten to lock it, so I was glad he reminded me. I went back to playing video games, and about 20 minutes later, my brothers Zach and Thomas ran to me and told me that there was someone in our backyard. We lived in the middle of nowhere in Kentucky, so not only was that a red flag, but it also made everything more terrifying and scary. It was 9 o'clock already, and my dad wouldn't be home for a few more hours. They said a stranger was tapping on the window and trying to get Zach, the second youngest of my siblings, to go out with him. Thomas ran back into the room when he heard Zach talking and pushed the man away. The crazy person actually got Zach to open the window for him. If Thomas hadn't come when he did, who knows what would have happened next. I called my dad, but he had no way to come immediately to us. So, as he rushed home, he called his friend who lived just a few houses down the street and asked him to check on us while he called the police. His name was Joey. Joey was almost like an uncle to us, so I trusted him and let him in when he got there. We told him what was happening, and that's when he went out and looked for the guy. He found the guy shortly after searching, hiding completely submerged in the shadows under the big pine tree we had in our backyard. Joey beat the guy up badly and threatened him. He told him that if he ever came back, he would make sure he wouldn't leave alive unless through an ambulance to the hospital. Joey said the guy actually peed his pants and told Joey that he was there for drug business and it wasn't what it seemed. And what's more surprising is that the actual police never showed up. I guess that's why my dad called his friend first, because the police are notorious for leaving us hanging when we call them and ask them to come, at least in our area. Joey waited until my dad came home before he left to ensure our safety. My dad never left us alone again after that night. We eventually moved to a different house about 8 months after that incident. The whole night was a complete nightmare. I will speak honestly here and will not embellish anything at all. My mother is an alcoholic and has been an alcoholic for as long as I can remember. Now, there's nothing wrong with having a drink here and there, even getting completely drunk from time to time as long as you act responsibly. Not doing things you shouldn't, unlike my mother, for example. I still love her very much because she's my mother. But she has definitely damaged me as a child. But I won't go into all those details now. I'll just talk about one particular night. My mother used to go out every weekend, Friday, Saturday, and even Sunday. Sometimes even going once or twice, sometimes even 3 times during the week. But when she didn't go out, 9 out of 10 times she would drink at home, either alone or with someone like a friend. I was a very isolated child, and I lived in a very financially and emotionally unstable home. Sometimes she would even physically hurt me too. I was only 9 or 10 years old when this happened, so you have to understand that I was very young, so I could barely understand what was going on around me. On this particular night, I don't remember what day it was or even what time it was, but it was dark, so it was late at least, and definitely nighttime. Any time after 9 o'clock might be considered late for me considering my age, although I was used to staying up until 1 or 2 in the morning, sometimes just waiting for my mother to come home. I remember when my mother left, I would feel very sad. This night wasn't any different. I never really got used to staying home alone either, no matter how many times she left me there. I would always be sad and scared. On this night I'm talking about now, she left without telling me at all. The only thing I had to entertain myself was watching the same 3 movies over and over again, and maybe playing with my Legos or something. I remember I had a puzzle that I could never solve, so sometimes I would work on it when I was really bored. I was lying on the couch when I heard the doorbell ring. When I answered it, I said hello, but there was no one on the other side, so I closed it. They called again almost immediately after I closed it. This time I heard breathing in the background, but still no voice. I closed it again after trying to get them to talk. I thought we had a bad connection or something, so when they called again, I picked it up again. "Hey buddy, where's your mom? Can I talk to her, please?" "She's not home right now," I said. "Oh, okay, thanks. I'll call back tomorrow." He didn't call me again after that. So I went back to watching my movie, and honestly, I didn't think much of it. A few minutes later, I heard a knock on the door. "Hey buddy, it's Joe. Please open the door. Your mom sent me to pick you up." Joe was my mother's former drug addict boyfriend who was using drugs with her at the time, which at the time I was too young to understand. I was also too young to understand the situation that was unfolding. However, he wasn't a stranger, so in my innocent mind, I thought I could trust him. He put me in the back seat and off we went. I asked him where we were going. He replied that it was a surprise. "I'm sure you know by now, but he kidnapped me." No, my mother never told him to pick me up or anything. The craziest thing about this situation besides me being kidnapped is how he got caught. A police officer pulled him over when he didn't use his turn signal, I think, and that's where my life would change forever. The police eventually found drugs in Joe's car and they arrested him. The police contacted my mother and found out that Joe wasn't authorized to pick me up either. My mother rushed home, and the police were waiting for her. She was completely drunk from drinking too much, and was almost unconscious when she came home. The police began questioning my mother and me all these questions, and my mother was eventually arrested too for neglecting me, endangering a child, having drugs on her, driving under the influence, resisting arrest, assaulting an officer, and a few other things, I'm sure. The police took me to my grandparents' house for the night until they could figure out what to do with me legally. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. They eventually adopted me after a few months there, and I stayed there until I was 19 years old. I moved out last year, and I am currently attending Michigan State University, and I'm studying psychology. I'm on my way to becoming a therapist. My grandparents paid for all my tuition fees, and they gave me the best childhood they knew. I'm so grateful to them, and words will never be enough to describe how blessed I am to have them as part of my life. They put me on the right path and gave me a chance to live a good life. I now have a girlfriend who I've been with for 3 years, and I am sure she is the one I will marry and start a family with. She is everything I could dream of. I still love my mother, but it hurts me deeply that we never had the close mother-child relationship I longed for since I was a child. She overdosed and died 2 years ago from heroin, so now I will never get that chance to mend the relationship with her. You might be wondering about my father now. He was never in the picture at all. As soon as he found out my mother was pregnant, he immediately left and never spoke to my mother again. I had to undergo some serious intensive therapy for everything that has happened in my life. I came back stronger, though, than what anyone might think I would be able to do. Life sometimes knocks you down, but you always have to rise back up. My grandparents' house has been broken into a total of 3 times in the last 30 years since they've lived there. They reside in the middle of a very secluded area, making it much easier for people who want to target their home specifically. They live on a long road that stretches for at least 25 miles into what feels like endless emptiness, with only a few houses scattered every quarter mile or so. 90% of what you'll see if you head to my grandparents' house is endless cornfields. I used to stay there 2 or 3 times a week when I was little because I loved going there so much. One thing I want to mention is how creepy it is at night at my grandparents' house. I always thought of myself as weird for this growing up, but a simpler way to describe the area is that it reminds me of Courage the Cowardly Dog, if you know what I mean. I'm sure you can get the picture. It perfectly encapsulates how remote it feels at my grandparents' house, especially being alone at night. Sorry if that sounds cowardly, but due to the simple fact that their house has been broken into before, I was terrified of how dark it would get outside. I was 17 at the time, so maybe I was too old to feel scared like that. But I guarantee if you were in my shoes, you'd completely understand. If you're at my grandparents' house in the middle of the night and decide to step outside, you'll hardly see anything. There are no streetlights whatsoever, and the only light in the entire area comes from my grandpa's pole barn. But its light is so dim and hardly helpful at all. It just adds to the tension, if I'm honest. I used to smoke weed when I was a teenager, and I knew I had to step out of respect for my grandparents if I wanted to smoke. They'd be really disappointed if they knew I smoked in their house, so I wouldn't do it there. It was around 6 p.m. when I smoked for the first time that day. I stepped outside and gazed at the sunset on the porch, took a little hit of my weed, and enjoyed the remaining sunlight. I got really high, higher than I planned, but everything was okay. I went back inside, grabbed some snacks, opened my backpack, took out my Xbox, and started playing Halo with my friends on Xbox Live. We played for about 2.5 hours, but my friends had to log off, so I did too. I get bored quickly when playing video games alone, so I decided it was time to smoke again, because the effects of the weed had completely worn off by now. I stepped outside and realized it was pitch black. I didn't realize how quickly time had passed. I didn't like the idea of being alone at my grandparents' house at night, but I knew it was coming, and I couldn't stop my uneasiness, so I had to deal with it. This time, though, I smoked right near the garage door, just 1 or 2 steps from the front door. I took hits of my weed maybe 5 times, and was distracted by my girlfriend as she messaged me. I stood there messaging her for maybe a few minutes, and I guess I was kind of distracted because I forgot that I was standing in my grandparents' front yard. I took one last drag and went back inside as I was packing up the small smoking apparatus I had that helped me manage the smell of my weed that I kept in my backpack. As I opened the door, I heard something rustle in the bushes to my left in my grandparents' woods. Initially, it was very frightening for me, and I immediately ran inside. I reassured myself and told myself that I was just being paranoid, that it was clearly an animal or something. My grandparents have over 3 acres of land, and most of it is woods. It wouldn't be too strange if it were a deer or rabbit or something like that. I ran through the garage that connected to my grandparents' house, locked both doors, and went inside. As I walked through the kitchen toward the living room, I heard a tapping sound coming from the front living room window. I peeked through the curtains to see what was going on, and there was a man dressed all in black staring right at me, maybe about 15 feet from the house in the front yard. He stood there for just a few seconds, then began running toward me. I ran and grabbed the phone and kitchen knife as quickly as I could. I called my grandma, but she didn't answer. I dialed 911 and debated whether I should call. That's when I heard the man breaking the sliding glass door window on the back patio. I ran to my grandparents' bedroom and hid under their bed. I called the police, whispering as quietly as possible to the operator so the intruder couldn't hear me. I heard the man moving through the house. He was getting closer every second. He got to the point where he was so close that I had to stop talking just in case he heard me. I waited until I felt safe and quietly gave the operator the address. I told her I couldn't talk and that someone had just broken into my house. Now they needed to send someone now. 3 officers arrived on the scene in less than 10 minutes. I heard the sound of police sirens, and I heard them all flood the house searching for the man. I yelled out to let them know my location, and I hid the knife behind me. Then they helped me out from under the bed. Once they knew I was the one who called, the man wasn't found anywhere, which left me very frightened. I immediately went home when the police left, and I called my grandma again the next morning. I told them what happened, and they immediately came home. It's safe to say I'll never stay at my grandparents' house again, and if I even consider it, I definitely won't stay alone. The man also didn't steal anything, so I'm not sure what his plan was. Maybe he got scared and had second thoughts about what he was doing. I'm not sure, and I might never know for sure. My childhood home had a lot of issues with its past. Many deaths occurred in that house before my family moved there. The most recent, the people who rented it to my stepmother and father didn't want to stay there because their child decided to end their life. And previously, there were even some murders that occurred in the house. We didn't know the details, but that's what the homeowner informed us. I was still young when my mother met my stepfather, and soon after they met, they moved in together there. I didn't experience anything strange until my baby brother was born, and that's when everything went wrong. The house had 2 bedrooms, so I had to share a room with my baby brother. Let's call him B. B never stopped crying, and when I was young, I really couldn't stand it. I remember one night when he cried for hours and suddenly stopped. I looked towards him and saw a dark figure hovering over his crib. It didn't move much, but when it did, it was slow and eerie. I was scared and hid under the covers until I eventually fell asleep. When I told my parents the next day, they thought it was just my imagination. This happened so many times, I'd wake up and see the figure near my brother's crib, always by the crib, never anywhere else in the room. After complaining about it for a while, I eventually slept in my parents' room with my mother, while my stepfather slept in my room. But many things kept happening. Shortly after I started seeing this figure, my stepfather lost his job. He was a hard worker, so it was really surprising for my mother when it happened. He fell into a deep depression. He loved his job so much, and losing it was definitely tough for him. I remember him sitting on the couch all day, every day, just watching TV. One day when I came home from school, I saw him sitting on the couch and the dark figure behind him. I remember it so clearly, just standing behind the couch. I didn't know what to do, so I just started crying, and my stepfather took me to my room to calm me down. When my mother came home, I told my parents about what I saw that night. Again, my stepfather seemed uninterested, and my mother just looked annoyed. No one believed me after that. There were some good weeks where nothing happened, followed by some weeks where this figure always showed up, usually near B or my stepfather. Some nights when I slept in my room, I would hear voices, a woman's voice coming from B's crib, just talking to him. I never understood the words that came out of her mouth, but it scared me every time. As B got older and started walking and talking, I noticed he spent a lot of time in that room talking to his friend. My parents never seemed worried, saying it was just B's imaginary friend. But I knew what it was. The more often this figure seemed to be around, the worse the emotions in the house got. My brother was always silent, never talking to anyone. My mother had so much anger inside her, and my stepfather was always depressed, and I always felt alone. Then my parents started fighting all the time, yelling at each other. My mother hated my stepfather for not being able to get a job, and my stepfather was just a depressed human being. It seemed like they fought every night, and every night it got worse. Meanwhile, in my room, I even heard my stepfather telling my mother to put the knife down. But the worst was the night I stayed up in the living room watching TV. It wasn't too late, maybe around 8:30, and my stepfather fell asleep on the couch while my mother was in her room, also tired now. I turned off the TV and walked upstairs to my room. But on the stairs, I started hearing whispers followed by B talking back to the whispers. The door was slightly open a few inches, and I slowly walked closer to look inside. Just a few steps from the door, I could see the figure next to B, as if trying to take him somewhere. I screamed, and instantly the door slammed shut. I just stood there crying and screaming before my mother rushed out of her room. I just pointed to the door, unable to say a word. She tried to open it, but it was locked. It was one of the cheaper doors, so she could use her fingernails to turn the lock and open the door. B was in the corner of the room facing the wall. My mother yelled at him for locking the door, even though he was too short to even reach the door handle. B didn't even seem to have any reaction. After that, I fell into depression along with what seemed like the entire family. No one talked to each other, no one asked how I was doing. I became the one taking care of my baby brother, me and the strange figure I knew. The figure even started to hover over my bed during nights when I was very sad, and it gave me some kind of strange comfort knowing that I wasn't alone. Eventually, my mother got fed up with my stepfather, and we moved in with my grandparents. I remember he told us to pack our things, and as we headed to the car, I saw the figure again near my stepfather. I felt sad leaving him, but at least he wouldn't truly be alone. I moved into a small apartment building last summer. It was a cheap 2-bedroom place, and really the only option I had given my low-paying job at the time. The building was clearly not well maintained, and neither were the rooms. There was a buildup of mold in some areas, and the place honestly looked like it was about to collapse. However, of all the things, one thing that stood out the most was the lack of other tenants. I've lived in a few apartment complexes before moving here, and rarely were there any rooms available. But in this place, almost all the rooms were still up for rent. It's a small complex with only 8 rooms, but during my time there, only 2 rooms were occupied, mine and a couple's on the first floor. My room was on the 3rd floor, leaving the middle and top floors completely empty. However, the floors never felt truly empty. After living there for a month, I occasionally heard people talking below me. I always assumed it was just the elderly couple because they were the only ones living below me. Strangely though, I only ever heard a woman's voice, not a man's. And to make it even weirder, I could hear them quite clearly, even though they were 2 floors below me. It always sounded like the woman was whispering to herself incoherently. Sometimes it gave me chills when I woke up and heard the woman whispering below me. But I figured maybe she was sleepwalking, and perhaps the ventilation in my room was connected to theirs, allowing the sound to carry through. But things only got worse over time. 2 months went by with no one moving out. I still often saw the door of one of the rooms open when I went up the stairs to my room, and when I passed the 2nd floor, I saw the door of one of the rooms open. My curiosity got the better of me, and I took a few steps towards the door to look inside. The room was dark and empty, which you would expect from an empty room, but I felt really bad the closer I got to the door, and eventually just continued up to my room. However, that night, when I took the trash down, I saw the door closed. It was really strange, but I didn't know what to think. I knew no one was living there. So, what could it be? Maybe the building owner was working in the room or something. That's the only thing I could think of. But that night I went to bed earlier with a clear mind. But I woke up in the middle of the night hearing the woman whispering below me again. After seeing the door below me open earlier, I was more curious about this mysterious woman this time. I got out of bed, making sure not to make too much noise, and brought my ear close to the cold wooden floor, listening. The whispering sound was faintly heard nearby, but also more like murmurs. I knew whispers couldn't possibly be heard so close if it was coming from the elderly couple's room on the 1st floor. At that moment, I realized this. I started to feel anxious. Part of me wanted to go downstairs to see if the door was open again, but I knew I was too scared to do that now. Sitting back on the bed, I started hearing the woman walking slowly, still talking to herself. It seemed like she was just walking with a random pattern in the room below me. After a few minutes, she suddenly stopped very abruptly. Needless to say, I was scared, and the woman suddenly went silent, almost making everything worse because I no longer knew where she was or what she was doing. But that night would get a lot scarier. I sat on the bed with my eyes wide open for 30 minutes, starting to wonder if the woman somehow left quietly, or maybe just stood in the same place for the last half hour. Either way, I was too scared to sleep, and that's when I heard the floor creak again as someone walked slowly across the floor. But this time, the sound came from above me. The soft creaks on the floor slowly made their way through the room above before stopping right above my bed. A few seconds of tension followed before the woman's soft whispers came from above me. Then she let out one loud, painful scream that almost sounded as if it was right in front of my face before the room fell silent again. I almost cried, holding my head and trying not to completely freak out. But how could I not? I stayed awake until dawn, then made arrangements with my family to stay with them for a while. I paid the fee to terminate my lease and moved into my parents' house while I looked for a new place. The only time I went back was to move my belongings into the moving truck, and as I loaded one of the last boxes, the elderly couple came out to bid farewell. I never really talked to them other than simple greetings as we came in or out, but they seemed really sad that I was leaving. I'm not sure if they ever experienced anything like what I went through, but the only thing I could focus on during our brief conversation was how different the old woman's accent was, and that it didn't sound anything like the woman I heard whispering. After that, I didn't know what to think, except how relieved I was to move out. All I can say is I hope to never hear the whispers of that unknown woman again. Even though this incident happened quite a while ago, I am still disturbed by this experience. Around September last year, I spent the night at my grandparents' house. That night, everything seemed to be relatively normal. We had a delicious steak dinner. My grandmother watched TV, and then looked at some old photos. As night fell, I went to the guest room, which used to be my room when we lived with them. Around 2 o'clock, I turned on my laptop to play some music as I got ready for bed to try to fall asleep quickly. Now let me tell you that there were some paranormal occurrences when we lived there, but I wouldn't describe them as terrifying or scary. For example, I always had a light sleep and would wake up if someone even walked quietly on the wooden floor outside my room. This happened several times, waking up to soft footsteps in the hallway near my room. But my grandparents assured me later that they didn't wake up at all. One time I even went to check, but all the doors were closed, and no one seemed to be awake at all. Overall, the layout of my room was somewhat odd compared to the other rooms. There was a corner in this room that led to a small hallway before you reached the entrance, so from your bed, you couldn't see the door, only the small hallway leading to the door. I definitely fell asleep quite quickly though, because I woke up suddenly without even remembering falling asleep. It was around 4 in the morning, and I felt very tired, which was somewhat unusual because every time I woke up in the middle of the night, I usually felt quite fresh and fine, which often was the reason my body woke me up. But this time, I was really tired. I didn't hear anything waking me up, but because I was so tired, I knew I didn't just wake up on my own. I looked towards the short hallway with half-open eyes, not seeing anything even though it was dark. I put my head back on the pillow and closed my eyes, lying for a few minutes in the silence on the verge of sleep before I heard a horrifying sound. The door of my room closed. I opened my eyes and lifted my body from the pillow, staring into the empty darkness of the hallway. I must have frozen in that position for a full minute before I got up from the bed and approached the door. There was nothing there, but I knew something was wrong. I always kept the door closed, so who opened it? The thought sent shivers down my spine, and I quickly locked the door before returning to my bed. I told myself it must have been one of my grandparents, even though I couldn't find a reason for them to open and close the door of my room. I tried to forget about it. I closed my eyes again and lay still as I usually did. The sound of heavy footsteps running came from outside the room towards the door. They sounded like heavy, bare footsteps, and suddenly stopped at the door of my room. I waited in extreme fear and total shock for several long and anxious seconds before I again heard the door slammed shut, this time loudly. After seeing the door close not even a minute before and never hearing it open, I was caught in panic. My heart was beating fast, and yet I felt too scared to move. I remained sitting on the bed all night until morning. I didn't tell my grandparents to avoid scaring them, and instead just gave an excuse to leave early and go back home a few months later. Even though I slept at a friend's house trying to fall asleep while lying on the floor, my eyes closed and my body facing away from the door, I heard it again. The door closing, but this time gently. I looked at my friend, but she was already fast asleep and didn't hear anything. When I asked her the next morning, to my surprise, I never heard it again since then, and I haven't heard it in my own house either. I almost don't know what I experienced, but I have a very strong feeling that I was being watched by a paranormal entity. I still don't understand the significance of the door closing and then closing again, but I would greatly appreciate it if someone could explain it to me, or even share with me methods to get rid of it, because even to this day, I lie in bed paranoid every night, afraid that I might wake up to something terrifying. My family found ourselves in a challenging situation in New York City. The virus was spreading rapidly, and the city had become an epicenter of cases. Fear and uncertainty gripped the entire population, and staying in our urban apartment became increasingly risky. With the number of COVID-19 cases skyrocketing and everyone around us filled with anxiety, my parents made a critical decision. We needed to leave the city to protect our family's health. Fortunately, my grandparents owned a beautiful lake house in a secluded area of Wisconsin, a place they typically used during part of the year when they weren't at their Florida home. The house had been vacant at that time, making it the perfect refuge for us. Our decision was swift, and we packed our bags, not knowing how long we would be away from our beloved city. The journey to Wisconsin was filled with uncertainty, but when we arrived at the lake house, a collective sigh of relief washed over us. It was a serene and picturesque setting, far removed from the chaos and fear that had engulfed New York City. It was almost as if the virus had no presence in that tranquil haven. The lake house was nestled near a small town, surrounded by dense woods. It offered us a sense of isolation that we desperately needed during those trying times. There was an array of outdoor activities available to us: fishing, kayaking, hiking, and swimming. It was a welcome distraction from the distressing news and confinement we had experienced in the city. For my brother and me, the change was significant. We attended virtual school in the mornings, but the afternoons were ours to explore the natural beauty that surrounded us. The routine offered a sense of normalcy in an otherwise tumultuous period. However, the tranquility of our newfound sanctuary was shattered one evening. My brother and I, accompanied by our parents, decided to venture to a nearby lookout point to watch the sunset over the water. As we returned home, darkness descended rapidly, and our sense of security was compromised when we discovered that the front door was unlocked. Apprehension crept over us, and my dad, taking security seriously, asked my mom if she had locked the door before we left. She believed she had, but the rush to leave might have led to an oversight. We cautiously entered the house, assuming it was a simple mistake. As night fell, I decided to unwind in my room, watching my favorite TV show. To my surprise, I received an airdrop notification on my phone, which I assumed was from my brother, sharing a meme. Little did I know, the video that began playing was far from innocuous. At first, the video was blurry, and I struggled to decipher its contents. However, as it continued to play, I recognized something chilling. It was a view from inside my closet. My favorite yellow dress with blue flowers hung there, captured in the eerie footage. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and my heart raced as the realization hit me. Someone had been inside my closet, recording me without my knowledge. Struggling to maintain composure, I quietly left my room and approached my parents, showing them the disturbing video. Fear and unease filled the room as we processed the implications of the intrusion. My dad, taking immediate action, instructed my mom to bring my brother into their bedroom, while he retrieved a firearm that was stored nearby. With the weapon in hand, he ventured into the dark unknown to confront the intruder. Minutes felt like hours as we waited in tense silence, our imaginations running wild. Suddenly, we heard my dad's voice raised in anger and multiple gunshots. Panic gripped us, and we feared for his safety. However, relief washed over us when he returned unharmed. He recounted the harrowing encounter. The intruder had attempted to attack him, but had backed off upon seeing the firearm. My dad chased the intruder out of the house and fired warning shots into the air to deter him. We promptly reported the incident to the police, but the identity of the intruder remained a mystery, haunting our thoughts long after that fateful night. During the initial outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, I was living in a small town in upstate New York with my guardian, Sarah. The early days of the pandemic were characterized by panic and confusion, with store shelves rapidly emptying and essential supplies becoming scarce. Despite the risks, it became clear that we needed to venture out to obtain crucial provisions. Sarah, a dedicated nurse, had her hands full with her demanding job at a local hospital as they dealt with the increasing number of patients. Given the circumstances, I decided to take on the responsibility of going to the grocery store myself. Equipped with a face mask and a resolute spirit, I embarked on a journey to the nearest grocery store, which was a few miles away. However, what I encountered was truly astonishing. The line outside the grocery store stretched around the block, a testament to the scarcity of essential items. I joined the queue, hoping that there would still be supplies available by the time I reached the entrance. While waiting in line, I struck up conversations with fellow shoppers who were also anxiously awaiting their turn. It was during these discussions that I learned the grim reality. The store had run out of supplies. To maintain order and prevent chaos, they had prepared identical boxes of essentials for everyone in line. Each box contained the same basic necessities, including toilet paper, toothpaste, canned goods, and other staples. As I inched closer to the front of the line, an employee made a disheartening announcement. The store had completely exhausted its supplies. My disappointment was palpable, given the long wait I had endured. I turned to leave, recognizing that my mission had been in vain when something unexpected happened. The store manager, who knew me as a regular customer, signaled for me to enter through a side door. When I approached him, he handed me a package, explaining that it was the last of the supplies reserved for employees. Grateful for his generosity, I made my way back home with the precious package in hand. Along the way, I encountered a desperate man who had clearly been scouring the town for groceries without success. He had 4 children at home, hungry and in need of sustenance. He implored me to give him the box of food. My heart ached for his situation, but our own pantry at home was nearly empty, and Sarah and I needed the groceries to survive. I apologized to him and explained our predicament, but he persisted, reaching out to grasp my arm. I managed to extricate myself from his grip and sprinted back to our small home, securing the door behind me. I immediately texted Sarah and called 911, recounting the terrifying encounter and requesting police assistance. While on the phone with 911, I heard persistent knocking at our door. Peering through the peephole, I saw the same man, now brandishing a long-bladed knife, tapping it menacingly on our door. Fear coursed through me as I relayed the escalating threat to the dispatcher. The man continued to threaten us, and his actions grew more aggressive. Eventually, he began stabbing the wooden door with the knife in a frenzied attempt to gain entry. My heart raced, and I knew that time was of the essence. Fortunately, the police arrived just in the nick of time. They confronted the man who resisted arrest, and after a brief struggle, they managed to subdue and apprehend him. It was evident that he was under the influence of some substance. The year 2020 will forever be etched in my memory as the time when the pandemic transformed my high school life, pushing classes into the virtual realm. My family lived in the midst of the bustling urban landscape, and both my parents held critical roles. My mother was a dedicated healthcare worker, and my father served as a firefighter, ever ready to face emergencies. With the pandemic-induced changes, my sister and I often found ourselves navigating the challenges of virtual learning while our parents fulfilled their essential duties. The apartment became our sanctuary, a place of refuge amidst the chaos of the outside world. But one evening, our refuge was disrupted by strange noises emanating from the apartment directly above ours. Our neighbor, who we'll refer to as Emily, had always been known for her quiet, introverted nature. These unusual sounds raised red flags and filled us with unease. Concern for Emily's safety gnawed at us, compelling us to take action. We decided to check on her welfare. Our knocks on her door yielded no response, and as we tentatively pushed the door, we were met with the sight of an unlocked entrance. Our cautious entry led to a chilling encounter. In the dimly lit apartment, we found ourselves face to face with a tall, agitated man. He introduced himself as Emily's ex-husband, Samuel, and asserted his presence in the apartment was to recover possessions he believed Emily had taken during their recent divorce. Tensions escalated rapidly as Samuel's demeanor grew more menacing. In a horrifying twist of events, Samuel forcibly locked us inside a closet. There, we sat in silence, our hearts pounding, while the sounds of Samuel rummaging through Emily's personal space echoed around us. Fear gripped us tightly, and thoughts of our safety consumed our minds. The only lifeline we had was the smartphone nestled in my pocket. Silently and discreetly, I used the phone's emergency feature to alert the authorities to our harrowing predicament. All the while, Samuel's threats and aggressive behavior escalated, plunging us deeper into a state of perpetual dread. It felt like an eternity as we waited for help to arrive, the minutes stretching out agonizingly. Finally, the welcome sound of sirens filled the air as the police arrived at the scene. A tense confrontation unfolded, during which the authorities skillfully managed to apprehend Samuel. Once we were freed from the confines of the closet, we received the reassuring news that Emily was safe, and that the intruder was now in police custody. Hey guys, Dark Tales Library here. I just wanted to say a big thank you for making it to the end of the video. It means a lot. And if you liked it, please consider subscribing. It helps out more than you know and also tells me what you guys like and want to see more of. Thanks again. My family goes on vacation every year to a different hotel and resort each summer. Usually we always leave together, my wife and my 2 young children. Most of the time we spend at the resort rather than going out and visiting other places. It makes it cheaper because we don't have to rent a car, and it's enjoyable to stay in a nice place and get away from everyday life. Of course, when we first arrive in the morning, we all unpack, and the kids immediately want to go to the water park. My wife and I sit in chairs around the pool, while the kids play with other children in the water park right next to the pool. We sit there enjoying the sun for about 2 hours, before we both decide that we should go back to our room to get ready for dinner. I get up and start walking around the water park looking for the kids, and after a few minutes, I finally manage to find Sam, the older one, and ask where Alan is. I've changed their names for privacy reasons. Sam says that Alan is playing with another kid on the other side of the park. I tell Sam that we're leaving and instruct him to run back to Mom while I go look for Alan. I search around like a fool for as long as maybe 10 minutes, starting to feel anxious when I finally see him. He's in the back corner where some chairs are arranged, talking to a little kid who looks about his age. I approach and briefly introduce myself, but they don't respond except to give a small smile. There's a few awkward seconds of silence, then I tell Alan that we're going to dinner and take him back to the hotel. I ask about his new friend, and he says that he was playing with him in the water park, but that's about all he says. Alan is a pretty talkative kid, so it's not something strange, but then he tells me something strange. He says that the kid introduced him to his parents, who then invited him to dinner tonight. I feel very weird that someone would invite a little kid to dinner without talking to the kid's parents. I tell my wife as soon as we get to the room, and she's also very worried. Finally, we go to dinner somewhere quick and get back to the hotel around 5 o'clock. Both kids look pretty tired, so we're ready to relax for the rest of the evening. We get into the elevator and head to our floor, but when the elevator doors open, Alan's new friend and his mother are standing there as if they've been waiting for the elevator to come down. As soon as we exit, the mother looks at me with a brief smile and asks if Alan can join them for dinner tonight. I glance at my wife, who looks just as confused and worried as I do. Then I look back at the woman. We've already had dinner tonight, but maybe we can arrange something for tomorrow. Her smile fades as she turns and walks down the corridor opposite ours. I assume to their room. I know both my wife and I are thinking the same thing, that they're creepily waiting for us near the elevator all this time just to ask about dinner. When we get into our room, we pull Alan aside and firmly tell him not to approach that family without one of us with him. He looks a little disappointed, but he agrees. I also pull Sam aside separately and make sure he knows about the situation, and that I want him to watch out for his brother if we're not around. We all take turns showering, then relax on the bed and couch for the rest of the night. I'm pretty upset with how the vacation is going already, having to feel tense for my kids' safety, but I reassure myself that tomorrow will be better. Finally, we all get ready for bed and turn off the lights. There are 2 beds in the room, one for my wife and me to sleep in, and the other for the 2 boys to share. A few hours into the night, I'm jolted awake. I'm startled because I thought I was quite tense, and I see Sam next to me still shaking. "You're okay, buddy?" Sam answers quietly, whispering to me that Alan is talking to someone at the door. I immediately jump out of bed and turn towards the corner leading to the front door. From the brief glimpse I can before yelling at him, I can see he's trying to figure out a way to open the door, and I can hear faint voices on the other side. I run towards him, yelling for him to stay away from the door. Alan jumps back, startled by the volume of my voice. I slam the door, hearing footsteps running in the hallway. As I finish opening the door, I know I should have just stayed inside and called for help, but I'm so angry. All I want is to confront the person, and as I'm in the hallway, I see a figure quickly. A man turning the corner to the hallway towards the elevator. I try to chase after him, but as I turn, there's no sign of him. He wouldn't have had time to get into the elevator, so I know he must be staying in a room on that floor. After searching for a few minutes, I run back to our room and meet my wife, who's already awake because of the chaos of the situation. I ask her to lock the door as I'm going down to the front desk to report the incident. As I descend to the lobby, my adrenaline starts to subside, and I try to calm myself down to be able to explain what happened. There's a young woman at the desk that I talk to, and I can sense that she's never faced a situation like this before. She calls a security guard to speak with me as well as their manager. After a few minutes of discussion, though it's quite clear they can't do much about it, they don't have security cameras in the hallway, only at the entrance and exit. I don't have any evidence or description of the man at the door or his relationship with the parents asking about dinner. Obviously, I assume it's the father of the other boy, but even though I'm pretty confident about the creepy parents' intentions, I can't really prove it. In short, the best they can do is give us a refund for the remaining days, so we have to move to another resort 30 minutes away. It feels incredibly terrifying as a parent to know that there's someone very likely trying to abduct your child, but there's nothing anyone can do about it. I hate knowing that the creepy parents might be out there right now trying to lure unsuspecting kids into their strange trap. Those people deserve to be locked up, and I hope that by sharing this experience, I can inform other parents about the real dangers and hopefully help save their children from those terrible people. What scares me the most is the possibility that the boy with them might be another child who's missing now. They're using him to lure other innocent children. We get into the elevator and head to our floor, but when the elevator doors open, Alan's new friend and his mother are standing there as if they've been waiting for the elevator to come down. As soon as we exit, the mother looks at me with a brief smile and asks if Alan can join them for dinner tonight. I glance at my wife, who looks just as confused and worried as I do. Then I look back at the woman. We've already had dinner tonight, but maybe we can arrange something for tomorrow. Her smile fades as she turns and walks down the corridor opposite ours. I assume to their room. I know both my wife and I are thinking the same thing, that they're creepily waiting for us near the elevator all this time just to ask about dinner. When we get into our room, we pull Alan aside and firmly tell him not to approach that family without one of us with him. He looks a little disappointed, but he agrees. I also pull Sam aside separately and make sure he knows about the situation, and that I want him to watch out for his brother if we're not around. We all take turns showering, then relax on the bed and couch for the rest of the night. I'm pretty upset with how the vacation is going already, having to feel tense for my kids' safety, but I reassure myself that tomorrow will be better. Finally, we all get ready for bed and turn off the lights. There are 2 beds in the room, one for my wife and me to sleep in, and the other for the 2 boys to share. A few hours into the night, I'm jolted awake. I'm startled because I thought I was quite tense, and I see Sam next to me still shaking. "You're okay, buddy?" Sam answers quietly, whispering to me that Alan is talking to someone at the door. I immediately jump out of bed and turn towards the corner leading to the front door. From the brief glimpse I can before yelling at him, I can see he's trying to figure out a way to open the door, and I can hear faint voices on the other side. I run towards him, yelling for him to stay away from the door. Alan jumps back, startled by the volume of my voice. I slam the door, hearing footsteps running in the hallway. As I finish opening the door, I know I should have just stayed inside and called for help, but I'm so angry. All I want is to confront the person, and as I'm in the hallway, I see a figure quickly, a man turning the corner to the hallway towards the elevator. I try to chase after him, but as I turn, there's no sign of him. He wouldn't have had time to get into the elevator, so I know he must be staying in a room on that floor. After searching for a few minutes, I run back to our room and meet my wife, who's already awake because of the chaos of the situation. I ask her to lock the door as I'm going down to the front desk to report the incident. As I descend to the lobby, my adrenaline starts to subside, and I try to calm myself down to be able to explain what happened. There's a young woman at the desk that I talk to, and I can sense that she's never faced a situation like this before. She calls a security guard to speak with me as well as their manager. After a few minutes of discussion, though it's quite clear they can't do much about it, they don't have security cameras in the hallway, only at the entrance and exit. I don't have any evidence or description of the man at the door or his relationship with the parents asking about dinner. Obviously, I assume it's the father of the other boy, but even though I'm pretty confident about the creepy parents' intentions, I can't really prove it. In short, the best they can do is give us a refund for the remaining days, so we have to move to another resort 30 minutes away. It feels incredibly terrifying as a parent to know that there's someone very likely trying to abduct your child, but there's nothing anyone can do about it. I hate knowing that the creepy parents might be out there right now trying to lure unsuspecting kids into their strange trap. Those people deserve to be locked up, and I hope that by sharing this experience, I can inform other parents about the real dangers and hopefully help save their children from those terrible people. What scares me the most is the possibility that the boy with them might be another child who's missing now. They're using him to lure other innocent children. I work as a security guard at a large hotel in Las Vegas in my late 20s. The pay is much better than almost any other job around, which matches my qualifications, but the most annoying part is the schedule and staffing. At that time, the building was struggling with a shortage of staff to cover shifts, so my schedule would be morning, afternoon, or night, all randomly throughout the week, making it very difficult to sleep sometimes. But again, I like the money. Anyway, I'm working the night shift tonight and I'm at the front desk talking to 2 of my colleagues. It's around 11, and my shift ends at 12. so we're just hanging out in the middle of our conversation when the phone at the desk where I'm leaning rings. Checking the number, it's from one of the rooms in the hotel, so I pick it up and ask how I can help them. A man speaks, saying that something is happening in one of the rooms down the hallway and that he's very worried about it. I ask what he means, and he panics, telling me to come up immediately because he's getting very anxious. I check the room number on the phone, then tell him that I'll send security up as soon as possible. Of course, although I'm only referring to myself when I put the phone down, I quickly explain the strange nature of the call to my colleagues, then head to the elevator and go to the middle floor where the room is located. Walking down the hallway, there's an eerie silence. I hope to hear anything the caller might say, but there's no loud sound coming from anywhere on the floor. I also somewhat hope the caller is standing near their door waiting for me or something, but the door is closed. I knock on the door loudly, announcing that it's hotel security. I don't hear any movement or sound coming out of the room at all, and after a minute with no answer, I walk to the end of the hallway, listening attentively for anything unusual, then go back to the door, knocking again a few moments later. Though the room behind me opens its door, and an elderly woman asks if I'm security. I say yes, and ask if they know anything about the strange noise or the caller from that room, to which they respond that they heard loud noises walking down the hallway a few minutes ago, but weren't sure what it was from their room, and their facial expressions looked very scared at this point. I've already started feeling very nervous, but the situation just keeps getting weirder. I grab my walkie-talkie and radio a message to the front desk asking them to call the room again and let me know if they answer. After what feels like forever waiting, they finally tell me that nobody answered. I stand there for a moment, trying to think about what to do before radioing back to them, telling them to check who's staying in that room. After what feels like forever, they finally tell me that nobody booked the room for the night, which confused me even more. I pull out my security key card and unlock the door because there shouldn't be anyone in there. The room looks clean and unused from what I can see. I search every corner and find nothing, but then I walk to the phone, flip it over, and get the serial number there. Then I go back down to the lobby where my desk is, and check the security logs for the timestamp of the call that was made from that room. Turns out, there's an active call record that was made from this room to the front desk, which I answered about 15 minutes ago. Obviously, the hotel doesn't record calls or anything, so all I can confirm is that someone was in that vacant room without permission. This eventually became a bigger investigation in the days to come because the next morning, one of the guests staying in a room on the same floor was reported missing by family members staying in a separate room. Security footage from all entrances and exits was checked, and the missing person was last seen leaving the hotel alone a few hours before the call I received. It's still unclear if the two incidents are connected or not, but it was definitely a very strange situation. I don't know how the caller could access that phone or who they are, but personally, I believe their reason for calling seems to fit someone being forcibly abducted based on their brief description. The person behind that mysterious call was never identified, and to this day, the missing person still hasn't been found